Okay. Welcome to a new masterclass within the Master's Degree in Military History of INISEG. My name is Juanjo Alarcón. I teach China-Taiwan relations at INISEG, and I'm your host, as always. Today, we go back to World War II and Normandy. Having studied the landing, Operation Neptune, and the battles beyond Beachhead, today we'll study the Battle of Normandy, properly Operation Overlord. So the title of today's lecture is Normandy Breakout and Pursuit, and our distinguished speaker is, again, retired Lieutenant Colonel Roger Cirillo from the US Army. But before welcoming our guest, we'll begin, as always, with a brief introduction to our topic by Professor David de Queixal, who, as you well know, is Director of the Master's Degree in Military History. How are you doing, David? ¿Cómo estás?
Muy bien, gracias, Juanjo. Preparado para una nueva masterclass.
So, go ahead, please.
Muy bien. Voy a hacer una pequeña introducción a la ponencia de esta masterclass del Coronel Roger Cirillo en cuanto a la gestión de la tercera de las últimas ponencias vinculadas al desembarco y a la propia campaña de Normandía el 6 de junio de 1944. Conocido como el Día D, el 6 de junio del 44, las fuerzas aliadas lanzaron un asalto naval aéreo y terrestre combinado contra la Francia ocupada por los nazis. Fue una de las operaciones más defensivas y decisivas de la Segunda Guerra Mundial. Aquel 6 de junio de 1944, alrededor de 150.000 soldados y 13.000 paracaidistas protagonizaron una de las batallas más decisivas de la Segunda Guerra Mundial, el desembarco de Normandía. Este episodio determinante y a la postre uno de los hitos más importantes de la historia del siglo XX fue la mayor operación naval, aérea y terrestre de la historia, pero sobre todo supuso el inicio de la liberación de la Europa bajo control del Tercer Reich. ¿Podrían haber ganado los alemanes la batalla de Normandía? Quizá un mejor servicio de inteligencia les hubiera permitido adivinar el fondo de la operación Fortitude. Podrían haber racionalizado su estructura de mando y mejorado sus suministros y adiestramiento. Los aliados nunca hubieran invadido sin superioridad aérea, pero se ha sugerido que los alemanes podían haber alcanzado al menos una cierta igualdad en el aire tras el día de produciendo y empleando como cazas un número significativo de sus reactores Messerschmitt M262, ya para entonces en servicio. También podrían haber mezclado vehículos acorazados con sus formaciones de infantería más débiles, incrementando la calidad general de sus fuerzas a cambio de unas pocas divisiones de escaparate. Podrían haber construido más submarinos o buques de superficie para cortar el vital eslabón marítimo del Canal de la Mancha. Hay muchas cosas que podrían haber hecho. Sin embargo, según cómo se desarrolló la batalla, no hay nada que hubieran podido hacer para poder ganarla. A nivel en que se libró la batalla de Normandía, el arte militar consistía en no permitir que llegaran a producirse tales circunstancias. La disputa entre Rommel y von Rundstedt en torno a la conveniencia de una defensa rígida o flexible no tenía la menor relevancia y ninguno de sus sustitutos tampoco logró sugerir nada mejor a esa, estrategia defensiva o ofensiva por parte de los alemanes. Lo cierto es que los generales alemanes que lucharon en Normandía mostraron su incompetencia durante toda la batalla. El general Patton, muerto en un accidente de automóvil en el 45, podría haberles dado lecciones de inventiva y de cómo obtener resultados a base de desobedecer las órdenes. Aparte de los niveles superiores de mando, el poderío aéreo y la artillería constituyeron los factores clave para la victoria aliada, pero no fueron los únicos. La interrupción de suministros y refuerzos al frente alemán tan solo tenía valor si al mismo tiempo los aliados atacaban y forzaban a los alemanes a ampliar esas reservas. La infantería aliada era de inferior calidad a la alemana y sus componentes no dudaban en identificar a los tigres, a todos los carros de combate que avistaban, pero mostraron un gran valor en su mantenimiento en la ofensiva. Gran parte de la fuerza alemana, no obstante, se basaba en el terreno en el que estaban luchando. Al igual que sucedió con las trincheras en la Primera Guerra Mundial o en las selvas del Pacífico, el bocage se convirtió en un enemigo formidable. Merece la pena destacar el hecho de que los propios alemanes no tuvieron tanto éxito como los aliados en sus ataques a través del bocage y que cuando perdieron su protección no tardaron en ser aniquilados. Se ha dicho siempre que un ejército refleja las características de la sociedad a la que pertenece. El ejército británico, que rara vez ha perdido alguna guerra, se suele alabar a sus oponentes y despreciarse modestamente a sí mismo. Con ello parecen querer sugerir, eran casi el mejor ejército del mundo, lástima que se enfrentaran a nosotros. Los norteamericanos, sin embargo, gustaban de elevarse a sí mismos a expensas de los demás, y antes conceden mérito a un enemigo que a un rival. El enfoque alemán convierte la guerra en un juego de moralidad, en la trágica derrota de meros mortales que se debaten con fuerza sobrehumana contra las fuerzas impersonales de las máquinas. Si los norteamericanos hubieran sido tan buenos como afirmaban ser, los británicos tan malos como afirmaban ser y los alemanes tan buenos como todo el mundo afirmaba que eran, quizá la batalla y posterior campaña de Normandía habría seguido un curso distinto. Y hasta aquí esta breve introducción. Juanjo, cuando quieras. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, David, for this pre-analysis in Spanish. And now it's time to welcome our guest. How are you doing, Coronel Cirillo? Welcome
I am
from
doing
Miami.
fine. Good evening, everyone.
Okay, good evening. Well, good morning for you, of course. And Cornel, before you begin your lecture, please allow me, as always, to read your CV, and then I'll give you the floor. Is that okay with you, sir?
Yes, very fine. Thank you.
Thank you. Retired Lieutenant Colonel Roger Cirillo served in the US Army from 1971 to 1995. He served in armored cavalry units in the US, Korea, and West Germany, on the staff and faculty of the Air Defense and Armor Schools. He was a war plans officer in NATO Army Central Group and served in the SINC, Commander-in-Chief Office, USA Rear United States Army Europe Command. He taught military history at the US Army Command and Staff College and holds a PhD in military history from Cranfield University at the Royal Military College of Science, Swindon in the UK. He is the author of the Ardennes-Alsace campaign and other publications, and assisted in the publication of more than 30 military history books for the Association of the United States Army, the AUSA, of which, by the way, INISEG is an international member. And last but not least, our colonel is the editor of the American Warrior series and the Battles and Campaigns series for the University Press of Kentucky. Well, impressive indeed. Now, without further ado, Colonel Cirillo, please go ahead with your lecture.
Yes. I'd like to start with the situation map for 30 June, which is up in the right-hand corner. This would have been the map that was published on the day of the intelligence summary at Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Forces. And this was the map that Eisenhower would have personally seen. What it shows is that the campaign, which started on June 6th, is now moved basically onto one front. They had captured Cherbourg only 2 days before, and the forces were now arrayed facing southward against the Germans. The Allies at this time had 8 U.S. infantry divisions, 2 airborne divisions, 1 armored division, and the British had 8 infantry divisions, 2 armored divisions, 1 airborne division, and 4 separate armored brigades. The Germans had on line deployed 16 divisions of the 55 that were then located in France, Belgium, southern France, and the Netherlands. And these were being reinforced at this time by 3 more divisions coming in from the east. 9 of these divisions were Panzer divisions. Now, Second Army, which is the British Army, which was on the Allied left flank, had believed that it had, by the end of June, knocked out about 200 German tanks, but there were still at least 625 tanks left in the line. The Allies were not yet fully deployed from the United Kingdom. The British and Canadians still had 5 more divisions to deploy to bring their force up to 16 divisions. And the Americans had 9 more divisions in France, but more than 40 more that could come from the United States. And these would arrive at the rate of 4 to 5 divisions monthly. Next slide. What this shows is the setup for the breakout. The Allies had conducted a number of limited objective attacks all around the front, trying to gain ground. But this was very hard to do. It was very good defensive terrain, and the Germans were able to hold them off pretty extensively. So what the battle develops into is a battle of attrition to destroy the enemy's armor while trying to gain some sort of ground. It was very heavily influenced by artillery. The weather in June was particularly bad, which limited close air support or deep interdiction missions. But there were interdiction missions that were being flown every day. Next slide. The forces that were arrayed due to this limited objective type attack can be seen in the graph on the right. What Montgomery had decided to do early on was to use the Second Army as the shield, where the First Army on the right would try to gain ground. The Germans deployed their armor in the best country available, which was in the east. So what you can see is in front of the British forces, there are always more tanks than there are in front of the American forces, which are primarily in the bocage. So it becomes a battle of fighting against German tanks that were deployed in depth around the perimeter. Now, this suited Montgomery, and what he did was try to grind up the German reserves by launching a series of limited objective attacks. Next slide, please. As you get to July, on the Allied left flank, the area around the Orne River, you could see that Montgomery is launching division and corps-sized attacks, trying to gain some ground and then to push the Germans back. Next slide. On the left, what you can see is that the Americans are trying to move south from the Cherbourg Peninsula to cross the swampy area and inundated areas that are on the left-hand flank. And they're trying to get a good line of departure in order to launch an army-sized attack. Now, this line of departure they defined as the Saint-Lô-Perrier Road, which you can actually see at the far end of where the arrows are. Now, until the Allies get onto that line, there is really no way to use all of the divisions together. Next slide. In July, Montgomery decides that July is going to be the month in which there are major attacks. And what he plans on doing initially is to hold the Germans in the east and launch the Americans alone on the right flank in the west. What happens is that the British commander of the Second Army, General Dempsey, says that we can actually do two attacks. You can do the American attack and a British attack. And so what eventually becomes the Cobra Goodwood plan is formulated, and it's published by the middle of July. Now, this is highly dependent on the Americans getting on their line of departure. In order for the British to attack out of the east, they first have to capture Caen, which was captured on the 10th of July. And then they want to line up their armored divisions for an attack that'll go in the day before the American attack. Next slide. Now, in order to understand how the two attacks fit, you have to look at the planning that was actually done in June. And what you see on the screen is the pencil sketch that was drawn by the original planner. It was Brigadier General Charles Richardson. And what he did was he divided the front in half and said there are two options. Option A, which is to attack with the main force in the east, and option B, which is to attack with the main force in the west. Now, this would be it was totally dependent on force ratios. By the end of July, the American army was much stronger and had much more reinforcements than the British. So what this initially leads to is the acceptance of what is known as Lucky Strike B. Next slide. Lucky Strike B shows that the main attack would happen on the right-hand side, which is what Bradley calls Cobra, and then the Allies would swing using Caen as a pivot towards the south and the east. And this essentially is the basic strategy that the Allies will follow once the two major attacks go in, understanding that Goodwood is a fixing attack on the left-hand side, and Cobra is the main attack on the right-hand side. Next slide. This brings to probably the most controversial of the plans that were used in the Normandy campaign. And this is Operation Goodwood / Atlantic. Now, if you look at the slide from the left to the right, you can see that there is a subsidiary attack launched to finish off the capture of Caen and to establish a flank on the Allied right-hand flank. That is Operation Atlantic. That is going to be conducted by the Canadian Second Corps using the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Divisions. In the center, you were going to use the British 8th Corps, which had 11 Armored Division, Guards Armored Division, and 7th Armored Division. And they would attack right up a corridor in the center. And on the extreme left, you had the British 1st Corps, which would hold the flank there and use the British 3rd Division to open a swinging flank for the armor to deploy. Next slide. Now, the entire plan is very heavily based on a bombing program. In June, the Royal Air Force and American Air Force had refused to use heavy bombers to support ground operations. By the end of June, Eisenhower was pretty much desperate as to seeing any kind of real movement, and he ordered the air forces to cooperate with the Army. And what happens is that they will use a bombing operation using more than 2,000 bombers to create a corridor for the armor to go through. The basic concept was to use the heavy bombers on the flanks to put in use large bombs and crater the area so there is really an obstruction on both sides. And then use fragmentation bombs against the half dozen villages in the center and at the extremes to take out the German gun line, and then pass the armored divisions through in column. Now, this is a very, very small area. The gap they're using is only 7,000 yards wide as far as the bombing goes. And while they had to clear their own minefields, their initial gap was only 1,000 yards wide. So you could see that the tank divisions are coming up with their battalions basically two abreast in a very, very small area, and they will follow the bombs through to the length of the corridor. Now, they also have about 67 or 670 guns that are going to fire a moving barrage, and several large cruisers offshore that are firing 6-inch guns, and one monitor which is firing 12-inch guns. Now, all of this is basically weather-based. The Army decides that if they cannot get the air bombardment, they will not counterattack or they will not attack with Goodwood. Next slide. And that shows the basic bombing areas. The heavy bombers are going against the dark orange ones. The light bombers are going against the others. To the right, what you see is the array of enemy forces, and to the next to it, you can see the actual bomber boxes. When I tried to put one on top of the other, it's almost unreadable. What you see deployed in the German force is that the Germans have a Luftwaffe division in the north with some tanks. Behind it, they have the 21st Panzer Division, which has roughly about 60 tanks. And behind that, you have two Panzer divisions in reserve. The Germans have over 300 guns within this area. And by guns, I mean 50 millimeter or 88 millimeter guns, both of which are tank killing systems. So when you look at it, the force ratio is that once you come out in the open from the ridge downward, you could see all the way to the length of the British attack. And there's probably 6 to 8 guns pointing at every tank that comes up there. So the barrage and the preparation fires are going to be very, very important. Next slide. If you look at a terrain map of the area, the Burgabus Bridge is not very high. It's only about 200 feet above sea level. And from the line of departure, it really looks like a dark line about 4 to 5 miles away. But on that ridge, you can see that the Germans have a significant number of guns that are spread out, and they are spread far wider than the concentration of bombs. Now, the British are concentrating very heavily on trying to smother those areas with fragmentation bombs, which will not create craters, but which will kill the gun crews. And this is really going to be the real challenge of the thing. The advancing corps commander, General O'Connor, wanted 2 bombardments. He wanted to go to the center of the advance and stop at the village of Cagney, and then have a second complete bombardment on the front slopes of Burgabus Ridge and on the reverse slope where they thought there might be more guns. The Air Force did not decide that they would do this, and this was because the Army did not insist on it. And you will see that the real problem then is that there is recovery time from the original time the bombs go off to the time the tanks actually arrive. The number of German soldiers killed is not as great as you would hope. And they are stunned initially, up to maybe an hour. But after that, they reman their guns and they come out fighting. Next slide. What you see here is the development of the battle. And the battle goes pretty good for about the first 4 hours. And 11th Armored Division gets to the center and then turns to the right towards the southwest. Guards Armor has a lot of problems clearing the center village. And part of the problem is there is not really a good armored personnel carrier that can carry their infantry along with the tanks. They're using open trucks or they're using half tracks. The 3rd Division that's supposed to come up, 7th Armored Division, actually stops at the mine gap and sits there for most of the day, refusing to get onto the battlefield because from their perspective, the battlefield is totally crowded with tanks. They have no maneuver room. So rather than trying to fight their way out to create maneuver room, they stay in the rear. And what you have developing by late afternoon is a real gunfight between the German tanks that are deployed on the left and right that are coming into the flanks and the guns that are at the far end of the ridge. The British lose at least 250 tanks the first afternoon. And of course, the battle stops at dark because nobody can see anything. All right. And the tanks will not move without their infantry, and the infantry do not want to move on a battlefield full of tanks in the dark because they're afraid of being crushed. The next morning, the battle starts again, and what they decide to do is to consolidate the ground that they have. They are about 1,000 yards short of the initial objective, which is Burgabus Ridge. Now, this means they've lost the effect of all the anti-tank guns that were supposed to be knocked out by the bombing. They've lost the effect of the cratering because the Germans have started to move 2 Panzer divisions forward right into Burgabus Ridge. And what they have is a gunfight that runs for most of the day, and the British lose about 200 more tanks. The next day, Dempsey decides, he's the army commander, that he will shift the battle into an infantry battle to seize the edge of the ridge, that he has gained all the ground he's going to gain by tanks, and he's going to pull them out. Now, part of this, it has to do with the weather. The weather turns on the 21st, and it pours rain, and it turns the battlefield into a big quagmire that if you move tanks around on it, all it's going to do is dig up the ground and create mud. So the battle kind of stagnates. Now, at the end of the battle, the British estimated that they had lost 493 tanks hit by anti-tank fire or gunfire. In reality, they lose about 230 tanks that are permanent write-offs. That is, tanks that have caught fire and burned and then blown up. And they lose about 5,000 infantrymen. The German losses are maybe 50 tanks, 75 tanks, and a few thousand men. What they've gained is about 40 square miles of battlefield. Now, this is a problem as far as the Air Force is concerned. The Air Force wanted a breakthrough, which is what the battle was originally advertised as, although they decided late in the planning that would never work, but they never told the Air Force that. So what they were thinking was that these guys were going to go all the way to Falaise and they would capture all the vital airfield ground, and that doesn't happen. Now, there's a second factor. Operation Cobra, the American attack, was supposed to go in on the 19th of July, one day after Goodwood. They did not even seize the village of St. Lo until the 18th. The Americans are not ready, so they're going to move their attack several days forward. Now, this means the British would have to fight on their own in an attack in which they were essentially in a reentrant. I mean, they've got a finger stuck in the German army and they're being shot at from all directions. So they decide to cease it. Now, due to bad weather, Goodwood or Cobra is not possible until the 24th of July. So what happens is you see the British attack stop, which is viewed at Schaeff as a total disaster because there's no big battle going on. And secondly, the twin battle of Goodwood and Cobra, which were supposed to only be a day apart, there's no symbiotic relationship between them. They're no longer mutually reinforcing because the Americans will attack by themselves. Next slide. And this, of course, shows how the battlefield forms, and it shows that there is actually a penetration. And the 2nd Canadian Corps takes up that penetration. And on the 25th of July, in concert with Cobra, they launch a small infantry attack of 2 divisions called Operation Spring. They take one little hillock, lose 1,500 men, and then stop. Next slide. Next slide, David. There you go. So what do you see on the eve of Cobra? You see the bulk of the German armor is still being fixed by the Brits. And Montgomery's happy for that because Cobra will be able to go ahead, and Cobra has 150 tanks in its area, but only about 50 online. So the American plan will go ahead with a 2,000 aircraft bombardment against very few tanks in depth. Next slide. The Cobra plan is very interesting. I actually met the Corps commander that conducted J. Lawton Collins and talked to him at length about it. And he actually came and talked to my class at the staff college when I was an instructor. And the students, of course, asked him about Cobra and all of this. Basically, the plan is that they will attack with 3 divisions on line, following about 2,000 aircraft that will drop bombs in the area, all fragmentation bombs, no heavy cratering bombs. The infantry will go forward, and then when they reach a certain point, they will release their tanks, and the tanks will then exploit to the ends. Now, the Americans have 4 corps on line, and they're only going to attack with 1 corps on the first day because they want to make sure they get a penetration before they launch the others to attack as supporting attacks. It's scheduled for the 24th of July, but the weather starts to turn bad, but the aircraft are already in the air. 2/3 of the aircraft are turned back. 1 bomber wing does not get the word that the operation is canceled. They drop their bombs and they drop short. And what they did was they killed about 40 Americans and wounded about another 100. But the operation is decided to go forward as planned the next day. The Germans are still looking towards the east. The German command believes that Montgomery will launch Goodwood II for a second major strike out of the Caen perimeter. And the position of the British armored divisions at that time was kept behind Caen to give the impression that they will renew that strike. So the next morning, the 25th, the bombs go in at 11 o'clock. Again, they bomb short. They killed 131 soldiers and wounded 140 more, or 490 more. They kill Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, who is visiting. He is the Army Ground Forces commander. And he is up front wanting to see the bombardment close hand, and he gets blown up by a bomb, quite literally. There's not much left of him. But the attack goes forward. Next slide. And what you see is that the infantry moves in very, very rapidly, followed by the tanks. And they are able to make the penetration with tanks because the tanks are now fitted with cutting devices that are made from the beach obstacles. They're called rhinoceros tanks, and they're able to push through and destroy the hedges. And what this happens is it starts an exploitation. Now, Bradley had always planned on going as far as Avranches, which is the base of the peninsula, and then turn into Brittany, although the plan does not say that. The oral part of the order says we will continue. The written part of the order says we will consolidate. Now, that's because Bradley did not want to be blamed for a failure. But everybody understood that the real objective was to go all the way to the base to Avranches. That's what Montgomery has in the orders. That's what Montgomery has in his diary. That's what Hanson's diary, Bradley's aide, says. So they expected that Cobra would work, and it becomes a remarkable success. Next slide. Now, once there is a penetration, what Montgomery starts to do is he tells O'Connor he's going to move his 8th Corps over to the right-hand flank and to attack right on the flank of the Americans as they move forward. And he calls this operation Blue Coat. And they move their armor at the last minute. So it takes, to move the armor on 2 single roads 50 some odd miles and reposition them takes about 4 days. It takes a lot of planning. Blue Coat has another bombing operation in front of it. Now, the problem is that this time the British armor is attacking through the bocage. They do not have rhinoceros tanks. They're just going to try and push their way through the bushes and everything else. And they're relying very heavily on the Royal Air Force, who comes in at dawn with 1,056 bombers and drops frag bombs all over the place in the hopes of unsettling and destroying the German front line. And they do a pretty decent job of that. And Blue Coat does move forward, and it moves forward about 10 miles and takes the only 2 pieces of high ground in that part of Normandy. Now, the Americans by this time are almost to Avranches by the 1st of August. So what you see is that there are 6 Allied corps ranging from Bayeux in the center all the way to the coast that are moving online. And the entire German right half flank is totally broken. And it's broken open, and the Allies are moving. Next slide. And you could see what happens around the first. You can see that the American divisions, they've got their armor on roads, because the Germans have no depth in the right. All their depth was out in the east where the ground was open, where they had all their armored divisions. There's still 7 armored divisions in front of the British at this point, and the Americans are just moving as fast as they can. And the right-hand corps is under the operational control of Third Army, which hasn't been activated yet by General Patton. And their job will be to turn right at Avranches and go into the Brittany Peninsula to capture the Brittany ports. So you can see that Cobra and Blue Coat are highly successful, and that Monty's idea of keeping the German tanks off in the east is working. Next slide. Now, on the 1st of August, what happens is the Americans, who now have almost 30 divisions in France, split into 2 armies, the First Army and the Third Army. First Army actually gives up half of its divisions and becomes 12th Army Group. And 12th Army Group is the insignia you see on the right-hand side, the downward pointing arrowhead. And British 21 Army Group still exists, and it has 16 divisions at this point. It's as large as it'll ever get during the war. Now, the ground force is still under the operational control of Montgomery, which is really annoying to the Americans. The Americans thought that the creation of 12th Army Group was going to be another declaration of independence from the British. And the fact is that Eisenhower does not have a headquarters in France large enough to actually control operations. So operations are still being controlled by Monty, although 12th Army Group is pretty independent in what it does. Next slide. What you could see as the front starts to develop is you could see the beginnings of a bulge, that the half of Third Army is moving south and to the east, and only 1 corps is moving to the west into Brittany. Now, the Brittany only has several divisions in it. What the Germans do is they move the divisions from the center of the peninsula into the ports, and they create fortresses. So the Americans drive all the way to Brest very rapidly, and they own the center part of the peninsula, but they don't own St. Mary or St. Malo, Lorient, or Brest, which are the main three ports. But they do have the Brittany Peninsula. Hitler decides the only way he can reverse this is with a counteroffensive, and it was Hitler's decision. He is going to move 4 of the Panzer divisions due west in one night and attack towards Avranches, which was the pivot point for Third Army, and cut off First Army and Third Army from their supplies. Now, the Allies know this is happening because they get the Ultra the night before. Now, the Ultra is not passed down to the divisions and corps. That did not happen. They were not authorized it. But the 2 American Army commanders, and Montgomery and Bradley, all talked and all knew that this was going to happen. Their intention was the counterattack, but continue the attack to the west and east from Brittany all the way east towards the Seine. Now, the Germans managed to get about 160 tanks, and they attack in the morning of the 7th of August, and it's misty and rainy, and there's not anything flying, and they gain some ground. They gain about 7 or 8 miles. At noon, the weather changes, and you suddenly have 1,200 aircraft that are flying over all these German columns. And the German assault comes to a halt. Now, despite the Air Force's claims, they really didn't destroy very many tanks. I would bet they didn't destroy 10 out of the 140. But everybody goes to ground, and the attack halts. Now, Hitler says, I want you to move more divisions in there, and we'll attack again in 2 days. Meanwhile, the Allied attack continues to go on. Next slide. They're still moving east and west at the same time. This is the farthest the Germans get is against the town of Mortain. And they cut off 2 battalions of the American 30th Division at Mortain, and they actually bypass them. Those guys fought for several days. We resupplied them by food dropped on them, and in some cases fired in dummy ammunition canisters that you would normally put leaflets into. We put sea rations into them and actually fired our food into the perimeter. I'm not sure how edible the food was when it got there, but they did actually do that. Mortain is a big heroic last stand, which never comes to play in the sense they're never overrun. But Hitler is still fascinated with attacking towards Mortain. And the Allied High Command is thinking, we'll just continue to encircle these guys. Next slide. At the time this is happening, Montgomery is not falling asleep. He is told the 1st Canadian Army, which has now been in existence since the 23rd of July, that I want you to take all your divisions and attack down the same road from Burgobus Ridge towards Falaise. Now, the 1st Canadian Army is commanded by an artilleryman, and the 2nd Canadian Corps is commanded by an artilleryman. So they come up with essentially what is a World War I limited objective attack, where you go from ridge to ridge following the barrage line. However, they're really impressed with air power. So what they want is a night attack with 1,000 bombers to hit the German lines in front of them. Then 2 infantry divisions mounted in these makeshift armored personnel carriers that they called kangaroos were actually self-propelled artillery guns with the guns taken out and infantry put in a hole. And they're going to drive forward, and at dawn, after they get as far as they can in the dark, two armored divisions following the two infantry divisions will press through and continue on the Falaise. And that plan is called Operation Totalize. So Totalize is being teed up at the same time the Mortain attack is going on. Totalize is planned on going in at 2300 hours on the 7th, remembering, of course, that the Mortain attack started at dawn on the 7th on the opposite flank. Next slide. And that, of course, Bradley sees that there's this huge penetration that they've made. And why don't we turn it into an encirclement? Now, everybody is saying this. This is not only Bradley gets credit for the idea, but actually it's in Monty's diary the day before that we ought to consider doing this. Eisenhower happens to be there. Bradley draws this circle on the map and says, we can do this. So they both call up Monty and say, we have this great idea. Can we encircle them? And Monty said, yes, by all means. Good Joe. We can do this. So what the plan is for the left-hand corps of Third Army, 15th Corps, to turn north. And this, by the way, happens to sync with Totalize, which is coming the other way. So Totalize is supposed to go to Falaise. The Americans draw their objective as Argental, which leaves about 10 miles between the two armies, so they don't bump into each other. And this is what the new plan gets to be. So this is what starts to happen between the 8th and 9th. The Germans have about 18 divisions in that area in the center, to include all of their armored divisions. Next slide. So what happens on the 8th is the Americans are starting their plan to turn to the north is the Totalize goes in. The bombers bomb short and hit a couple of the units. Not badly, but enough to cause a few casualties and an awful lot of consternation amongst the infantry. The infantry goes in and gains about 3 miles. And what Simmons has decided before this went in was he wanted a second bomber attack to coincide with the daylight breakthrough on the 8th. So at 1200 hours, the bombers go in again. Okay, the second set of bombers. This time it's American bombers because they use the British bombers in the dark. And they hit the German gun line, and they hit themselves again, another short bombing. And they do move, and the total movement is about 5 miles. Now, you're probably asking yourself, why did they only gain 5 miles after dropping 5,000 tons of bombs in two operations? Well, they're pressing against German armor. The Germans not only have 2 armored divisions, they have about 188 millimeter guns in this area. So you are attacking this tremendous gun line. And it's really a matter of how well you could suppress it with either the air attack or your own artillery. And the Canadians take some pretty heavy casualties. It's not like they're not doing anything. But after 5 miles, they stop and they say, we got to recock this whole thing. Meanwhile, the Americans, of course, as you've seen from the previous slide, are turning north towards Argental. Next slide. Now, what you see is the formation of what becomes known as the Falaise pocket and the beginning of the turn of 15th Corps. 15th Corps has 2 armored divisions. The French 2nd Armored Division, who just come into play under General Leclerc. Very interesting man. He dies in Vietnam in 1948. the American 5th Armored Division, which is a brand new division, and the 90th Division, and they are told to go to Argenton. There's nobody in front of them. And they actually pass through Argenton, start slowly to creep up. Now, this is where intelligence comes into play. Ultra is reading all the doggone message traffic that's going between Hitler, General Eberbach, von Kluge, everybody in the German high command. And what Kluge orders is that the panzer divisions will break contact and attack the shoulders of the penetration. Bradley sees this, and the last thing he needs is 100 German tanks to overrun the shoulder. So he tells them to go back to Argenton, and they put in essentially a 3-division hedgehog. Okay, they're building a defense around it. And meanwhile, the Germans are streaming out towards the east, trying to find a new defense line. Next slide. Back in the north, the Canadians are going to try another plan, and this one will start on the 14th. This one will use a daylight bombing, using British bombers, by the way, and they will put 2 armored divisions, bypass Falaise. Falaise is no longer considered the objective because that's where all the German guns are. They'll try to get behind these guys and then cut them off, and that'll meet the Americans that are in the south. Now, they specified they wanted the Royal Air Force to do this. Unfortunately, Allied expeditionary air forces did their lessons learned planning and said, look, the reason we keep bombing guys is they're not well marked on the ground, our guys. So what we want you to use is yellow smoke to mark your positions. The Canadians get this message, so they're going to use yellow smoke to mark their positions. The Royal Air Force does not get this message. So they send in their Pathfinder aircraft to mark the objective, and then they're going to bomb it. And what color do they use to mark the objective? Yellow smoke. So what happens is the Canadians now get this precision bombardment put on top of them on their lines of departure. And they lose a couple of hundred guys, and it kind of screws up their tank attack somewhat. However, the 4th Armored Division and the Polish 1st Armored Division, which is the guys on the outside, start their attack on the 14th, despite their losses. And they move essentially for the next 2 days against very heavy armored operations. That's because, as you remember, the German armor on the inside of the pocket is now pushing at the edges of it. Plus, there's a German panzer division outside of the pocket that's attacking towards the Poles. Now, we're not talking about a lot of tanks. The total number of operating tanks and the attacks in the north and south are maybe 70. If they reached 100, I'd be very, very surprised. But in the north, 35 of these tanks happen to be Tiger tanks, because all the Tiger battalions were in front of the British. There's only 3 heavy tank battalions in the German army that have Tiger tanks, and they had stayed on the Caen sector. They did not go into the Bocage. So the Shermans are duking it out with not only 88s, but they're duking it out with Tigers, and they're not getting very far. The Americans, meanwhile, are told by Montgomery, we're not going to catch them all, so make your loop wider. Next slide. And you could see that this is what happens, that the U.S. 15th Corps is told to leave divisions and pick up other divisions that are now moving into Third Army's area. And they have a change of command. And it's real funny because what Patton does is he gets Hugh Gaffey, his chief of staff, and 3 officers. They're going to make a 4-person headquarters to take command of the attack going north. Bradley, in the meantime, says, no, I got a pinched out corps. I'll move the U.S. 5th Corps there. And 5th Corps is a bunch of infantrymen. Their General Giroux, who landed on Omaha Beach, has been gun shy ever since. He looks at the plan and says, no, we're going to reorganize this. So they lose a whole day moving north and west. Meanwhile, the Canadians are trying to come around. The Americans are trying to widen this loop. And this goes on while the air is starting to hit these guys. Now, in the pocket, next slide. Inside the pocket, you could see that the intelligence claims there's 18 divisions in that pocket. If you figure the scale of the map and figure the size of the divisions, I don't see how 18 divisions could have fit in there, to tell you the truth. But as far as their headquarters is concerned, there's 18 divisions in there. During the next 5 days, the Air Force flies 12,787 sorties against the enemy inside the pocket. Now, this area is very heavily treed, has narrow roads, and it starts to get very hilly, almost cliff-like hills in a couple of cases. So the Germans are pretty much stuck on roads, and you can physically see them. So the Air Force is doing a lot of damage to the horse carts and the trucks and the vehicles that are in there. The other thing that has happened is that all the vehicles that are in the pocket, there's very little fuel going from east to west into the pocket. So most of the tanks are running out of fuel and run out of fuel and are abandoned. And pretty much the same thing happens to the vehicles. So if the vehicles are not destroyed by air, they're pretty much being run out. Now at night, what happens is all the road intersections are being shelled by the Allies. They're shelling off the map. And what you have happen is that the Germans are still trying to stream out of there. Now, the initial estimate was there was between 80 and 100,000 Germans in the pocket. And we knew a bunch of them got out, but a bunch of them were killed. An incredible number were killed. Next slide. The Germans are still conducting the attacks to hold open the pocket, and the pocket actually closes on the 21st. So it's about 7 days that this agony goes on. We estimated that there were 10,000 Germans killed in action in that pocket. We took 50,000 prisoners. We found 90 tanks, 3,500 trucks, 300 cars, and God knows how many dead horses in that pocket. But the Allies, depending on who you wanted to blame, thought that maybe 20 to 40,000 men got out. Whether those guys actually were in the pocket is very difficult to say because the German reports count men differently. They don't count the number of men in a division. When they sent the division summary up, they counted the number of riflemen at the front. So you could have a division reporting we have 10 tanks and 350 men, when in reality they have 12,000 men. That's exactly what 12th SS Panzer reported, by the way. They had 12,000 men, but they only reported 350 fighting and 10 tanks. So the Allies are looking at this, and they're disappointed that these losses don't turn up. Now, to make a long story short, 2 weeks later, we took 25,000 more prisoners near Mons. And my guess is that a large percentage of those guys captured at Mons were the guys that got out of the Falaise Gap. Now, the Allies really wanted this double canine type attack because they thought it would end the German army in the West. And of course it doesn't, because there's 35 divisions in the West that haven't been employed yet, that are either on the North Coast or in southern France. Next slide. So what you now have is this rampaging army, and look to the right top corner, and you can see that that's Patton's 8th Corps, failing to capture the ports, but captured all of Brittany. Those ports were essential for the deployment of the American army and all its supplies. And not having those ports is going to be a major problem. You can see this big pencil move across the right, which is Patton's other 2 corps. And they're moving tremendously because there's nobody in front of them. Everybody was either pushed north or they're in southern France or on the North Coast. There's nobody there. And so this drama is really a pursuit. It's not a battle. And what happens is that the Neptune plan, which figured we would be on the Seine by D+90, we actually crossed the Seine on D+79. And essentially, this is the fini for the formal part of the Normandy battle. We estimated German losses at Normandy to be 400,000 men, which I think is a bit high. In reality, the Germans claim they lost 291,000 men in Normandy, of about 600,000 that were deployed to the west. But they still have 500,000 men left in the West. The war is not over, even though the generals paint it as we're on the way to Germany, the war's going to end, war could be over by Christmas. That's not true. Now, the Germans deployed about 1,700 tanks in Normandy, and less than 200 of them still exist after the Falaise Gap. Now, what happened to these tanks? Well, from studying the hulks on the ground, we figured about 90 of them were knocked out by the Air Force, not the 2,000 they claimed. About 500 of them were probably knocked out by either anti-tank fire or tank fire. And the rest of them were abandoned due to lack of fuel. I mean, tanks have to have fuel. They're not fuel efficient at all. And air power chewed up the lines of communication. And once you got stuck into this pocket, there was no way to get fuel into the tanks. Next slide. So we're going to talk about armor. There's two primary weapon systems that are important in Normandy. The first of which is airplanes. We had air superiority. Okay, the Germans never moved aircraft to attack the army on the ground. The only air sorties you saw were at night, which were either photo flash reconnaissance, which they did a lot, by the way. They flew over our lines at night, dropping flares and taking pictures, and their radio intelligence was excellent. So they had a good idea where our troops were, and by the RT intercepts and traffic analysis, they pretty much knew which units they were. But they didn't use airplanes. Where were those airplanes? Those airplanes were defending the Reich. You have to remember that in 1944, we finally had long-range fighters, and they were taking the bombers all the way to Berlin with escorts, and they were killing the German Air Force at an incredible rate. Part of which is because the Germans did not have a robust training program, and then later they ran out of fuel, so they had to cut the training time. The German pilots in 1941 were extraordinarily good. The German pilots you ran into in 1944 were either aces with 100 kills or somebody that's got 20 flying hours. And if it was the guy with 20 flying hours, he got shot down immediately because he wasn't very good. And they were taking terrible, terrible losses. The German Air Force fought till the last day of the war. If they had gasoline, they had a lot of planes. They had planes that were still being produced. Most of them, however, did not have fuel, but they did fight. So the German Air Force is not a big player. The bombers beat up the rail lines very badly, but they never cut off rail traffic completely. You have to view the interdiction campaign as an obstruction of supply, not a destruction of it. The Germans were short. They always were short. But they still got fuel and ammunition, which is why they continued to fight right up until they were pocketed. I would not downplay the aviators. I mean, a lot of aviators died. There were 1,800 tactical aircraft shot down over France and by ground fire and supporting the ground armies. They did a good job, but they were not overly decisive by themselves. The second weapon system you should look at is the tank. The tank was the reason why the Germans were able to hold the British off, because their infantry was thin on the line and they got suppressed by artillery, but they generally had tanks behind it. Their tanks versus our tanks were very interesting. They killed our tanks at least 3-1. They had very, very good guns. The problem was that even though we outnumbered them, and sometimes as much as 6-1 with tanks, there was no maneuver room to maneuver to the flanks and get around them. So most of the fighting with armor is frontal. There's almost no flank shots in the Normandy campaign. It's much easier to back up to another position and keep shooting forward than it is to try to counterattack and maneuver. Now, once you broke the line, all the dramatic advances that you see are made not by walking infantry, but they're made by tanks. An infantryman can carry material, can average about 12 to 15 miles a day. That's been proven since the time of Christ. The Roman army never moved more than 20 miles in a day. It averaged 12 miles a day. What you see in all these great advances, they're being led by armored columns. We had about 5,000 to 6,000 tanks in Normandy by the 1st of August. And we will always have a superiority in numbers against tanks with the Germans. But in tank-to-tank fights, unless you have air support or artillery, and it ends up a frontal fight, you're going to lose. You're going to lose about 3-1. There's only one really good tank fight that the Americans win in the Second World War, which is near Ericourt. That's because they got behind the German Panzer Brigade and they ate it for lunch, and with mostly flank or grill door shots. But frontally, it was very, very difficult to do that. So the two weapon systems that really dominate the battlefield are tanks for movement and airplanes. Artillery is incredibly important. Infantry can't move without artillery. And the numbers of rounds that we fired per day per gun was just only limited by how many trucks you could bring forward. For Operation Goodwood, they had 500 rounds per gun per day laid out next to their guns to fire. And the Americans were firing comparable shoots. So when you looked at division assaults that were limited objective, they generally had 12 to 15 battalions of field artillery firing, and each of those guns firing 20 to 30 rounds in the prep. So those were the things that you should look at when you look at it. And from the point of view of logistics, artillery and fuel was the thing that dominated logistics all the time. Next slide. Now, what happens? We cross the Seine, and then immediately there's an argument as to what we're going to do. And that's a completely separate chapter, the broad front. Montgomery wanted to move both of the army groups to the northeast, north of the Moselle River, go into Germany and go straight to the Ruhr. And at the same time, he would have cleared out all the northern coast ports, which he needed to include Antwerp. The Americans were very hot about getting into Germany because there was nobody there. So they wanted to go east through Metz. And if you remember, on the 15th of August, there was also the invasion of southern France. And we were coming up through the Rhone Valley, and that would form a front. On the 1st of September, the two army groups went under Eisenhower's control. On the 14th of September, Eisenhower was forced to give up operational control of the strategic air forces, went back to the combined chiefs, and he became the land forces commander. And then, of course, the war continues until May. At the end of Normandy, the Allies have over 2 million men in France, and it comes to about 37 divisions, 16 of which are British, Canadian, or Polish, and the rest are American. And in September, you add 8 French divisions to the Army group, plus more American divisions, the 6th Army group. So Eisenhower has 3 Army groups online. The total losses, according to the Schaeff Daily Report on 31 August, the day before Eisenhower takes command, are 202,000 casualties, of which about 25% are dead. And that's what we lost. The Germans, by that time, with the numbers that were encircled in the ports, would have lost about 400,000 men. So that's basically it. And that's Normandy in a large nutshell. Do I have any questions? Well, actually, I know I have 2. I have I talked to the air. Someone wanted to know about how important the resistance was. The resistance did punch above its weight. It provided a lot of intelligence. It cut German communication lines dramatically during the Normandy invasion. And it caused the Germans to put a lot of people in the rear looking for things. They were not operationally decisive, but they did contribute. And it was important to French national morale to show that the French were fighting for their own liberation. And that is something the Americans and British always underestimated, was that the French wanted to participate in their own liberation, which is why their French First Army in Alsace is very, very emotionally important to the French. And they did fight well. They had excellent soldiers. more than half of whom were colonial soldiers, I might add. I answered the question about air power, and the third question was did the Cold War develop from the Americans and British being on one side of the front and the Russians on the other? Well, certainly geometrically it did, because the lines ended with Europe split with those armies. But at the time, we did not believe that the Russians were going to be our enemies. We had believed that the occupation would be very short, maybe 2 years, and that all the armies would go back after the German war criminals were tried and the German government was reestablished. And of course, the Russians did not want to give up the terrain that they had taken. They maintained an army. I saw the Russian army leave in 1991, but physically I saw it leave. And I certainly saw a lot of Russian soldiers while I was in Europe. But those were political differences that the politicians had not envisioned would continue on. They thought there would be a peace treaty, an occupation for a period of time, and then everything would go back to the way it was. And that's not how it happened. Does anyone have any questions? Can I help anyone?
Yeah, of course. Thank you very much for
Okay.
taking my job. You didn't allow me to read the questions, but
I
the
didn't
first
realize you were going to read them. I thought I was supposed to read them on my own.
No problem, no problem. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. By the way, thank you very much for your presentation. We have truly enjoyed it. Amazing maps and graphics, by the way, very interesting. And so congratulations, sir. And I have to add 2 questions from the
Okay.
questions you have already answered, because you talk about the resistance, but the question was about if it was effective as it is claimed, the French resistance during the Operation Overlord.
It was very effective the first week, because what happened is the Germans cut all the phone lines, and it became very, very difficult for messages to be sent by telephone or telegraph. And this forced the Germans to use radios. And what happened is then the ultra people were able to intercept the radio transmissions, decrypt the messages because they were encrypted. You know, they were coded when they were sent. They didn't talk on the clear. And we got a tremendous amount of intelligence from it. And secondly, the Germans had to coordinate complicated things by using messengers. So they had the fly messages from Germany to France, and so the phone network and telegraph network was not completely destroyed, but it was significantly impaired, and that was a major thing. As far as the resistance killing German soldiers, it certainly did kill German soldiers, but not to the extent that it was felt at the battlefield. The French people paid a terrible price for the liberation. The official estimate of numbers of French killed by air power was about 10,000, and that is not true. The actual numbers, when you count the headstones and cemeteries, comes out to about 60,000 French citizens killed by air power. And when you took into account the numbers of people that were in the way during the battles, France lost as many people, citizens, killed during the liberation as we killed Germans. That's incredible. That's absolutely, they lost over 100,000 dead And they never complained about it. I mean, they considered that was the price of liberation. But war is terrible, and it's very difficult to limit it. And the Germans tried to evacuate the populations, but where were they going to go? Particularly when the Air Force was strafing everything on the roads. Most Frenchmen went into their cellars, and then we bombed their houses. And it was just terrible. So what was your other question, sir?
There is a third question, final question, which is Field Marshal Speer's Third Luftflotte had less than 1,000 aircraft to defend France. Under these circumstances, what was the role of the Luftwaffe in the Battle of Normandy against that Allied air superiority?
The problem was that although there were aircraft moved forward, we were flying 5 to 10,000 sorties a day coming from west to east. We knew where all our airfields were. So what that 1,000 aircraft did were fighting air battles increasingly over their own airfields. And eventually they were pulled out. They were pulled out because they weren't worth the cost. They weren't stopping the invasion, and they were outnumbered in the air. So they withdrew them to defend Germany. So the role of the Luftwaffe in France is very low. You know, the German soldiers had a joke that they used to tell each other. And they'd say, if you look into the sky and you see a green airplane or a silver airplane, it's American. If you look into the sky and you see a green airplane, it's British. If you look into the sky and you see no airplane, it's the Luftwaffe. Because they didn't have anybody flying over them. They just didn't. So I think it was a matter of numbers. And you also have to remember that the Luftwaffe, 50% of it was still in the east, flying against the Russians. So you had half of it in the defense of Germany and half of it in the east, and they had very little to fly over the front lines. So he failed completely.
Okay. Thank you very much. There is a final question, an extra question from David. David, go ahead with your question for our guest.
Thank you, Juanjo. The question is this. On August 4th, 1944, despite Marshal Kluge objections, Hitler ordered a counteroffensive from Vir toward Avranches, called Operation Lüttich, to counter the British offensive in Operation Blue Coat. What were the objectives of these German operations? Was it successful?
Operation Liège or Lüttich was designed to cut off the American First Army from its lines of communication. Because by the time it was launched, we already had divisions south of Avranches, 2 of which were going west, or 3 of which were going west into Brittany, and 9 of which were starting to spread out to the southeast and then go east. If Lüttich had succeeded, you would have cut off the Third Army. And within about 2 days, it would have been out of fuel. But I don't think that Lüttich could have succeeded. I think it's a bold plan, and it's a good staff college exercise. But the Germans did not have air superiority, which meant that their supply columns were going to be hit. And secondly, we had over 1,500 transport aircraft that were available to fly fuel and ammunition to the troops that were past where the German penetration would have been. We were actually, when you looked at the employment across France, we were flying about 500 tons of fuel a day to Patton's army with C-47s. and they were landing on captured airfields, and they were delivering 500 tons of gasoline a day to those tank columns that were going towards the Seine. So Luttich was not an operation that any of the German officers believed could be done. They knew they could only move at night. The road net in the bocage is not exorbitant, so you would be forced in the columns, and those columns, once daylight happened, would be targets. The reason that Luttich got some effect initially was, as I mentioned, it was done in bad weather. The morning of the 7th, it happened to rain, and it was heavy mist, rain, and very low observation. So all the aircraft were grounded. Once the sun came out around noon, the 9th Air Force and the 2nd Tactical Air Force went straight to Avranches. They knew what. They just circled over those areas and just shot up everything on the German side of the line. So it was just not possible. The one thing that you should notice is that part of German doctrine is to launch a counterattack against an attack. And that includes launching a counteroffensive against a major offensive. So what you see is in France, the Germans try 2 offensives, Luttich and the second phase of Luttich, which turned into the Mortain-Falaise Gap. You will also see the Germans launch an offensive in Lorraine in September, which will peter out. And then you'll see the Ardennes offensive in December, where they launch a 30 division attack trying to cut off 21st Army Group. The Germans are always going to launch a counterattack. And, and their idea was to have operational effect. You need an operational sized attack. So you need at least a corps or an army. And when you look at all the actions that went on in Normandy, if you look at Perch, Epsom, Charnwood, Goodwood, Cobra, Totalize, Tractable, every single one of those attacks is met by German counterattacks, which is why they go so slowly. Which is why they go so slowly. And also, in a lot of cases, the reason why we suffered such heavy casualties. And the basis for all of those attacks were tank units. That's why I said when I was talking about the tanks, you have to look at the placement of tanks on the battlefield. The Germans that used the tank as a counterattack weapon, not a defensive weapon, was always a counterattack weapon. And they had very great effect. That's why we lost so many casualties.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Roger, for your answer.
Thank you very much, Coronel Cirillo, for your answers and for this awesome presentation. Thank you, David, for your question and your analysis at the beginning. And now I'm afraid it's farewell time, sir. We hope to see you again soon in another masterclass,
Okay.
Coronel. Because you are at home here, you know it, right?
Right.
You know that you are at home. You are always welcome here, okay?
Okay, thank you very much. Everybody have a good evening.
You're
I
welcome.
got to go look at the election results. They haven't called the election. We have a new president, I suppose, but they haven't totaled all the votes up.
We'll see. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
But for now, I have to say goodbye to everybody, to our guests, Coronel Cirillo, to David. To our audience for being with us one more time, please visit INISEG's website, that is www.iniseg.es, to keep post about our next masterclass. So for today, I have to say bye-bye, everybody. Everybody take care and see you next.
Have a good evening. Good night, David.